In 1492, a single kingdom held 3 world-altering events in its hands within the span of 8 months: the fall of the last Muslim city in Western Europe, the expulsion of an entire religious community, and the launch of a voyage that would redraw the map of the earth forever. No other state in history compressed so much transformation into so brief a moment. And yet this was neither the beginning nor the end of Spain's story. It was merely the hinge. This is the complete journey. From Phoenician traders anchoring their ships off the rocky southern coast more than 3,000 years ago, through Roman roads and Visigothic crowns, through 8 centuries of Islamic brilliance and Christian reconquest, through the forging of a global empire that stretched from Manila to Mexico City, through rivers of silver and decades of war, through collapse, civil war, dictatorship, and the slow, hard-won return to democracy. Every ruler, every turning point, every ordinary life caught in the machinery of empire. From the miner deep inside the mountain of Potosi to the bureaucrat in the Escorial, from the conquistador on a jungle trail to the sailor on a Manila galleon. More than 500 million people speak Spanish today across more than 20 nations. The colonial plazas, the legal codes, the faith, the food, the very shape of cities from Buenos Aires to the Philippines, all of it traces back to decisions made on the Iberian Peninsula across 1,000 years of ambition and exhaustion. If you enjoy complete journeys through the rise and fall of civilizations, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each week we walk through the full life of a world that shaped history. Let us begin where the land itself begins, at the edge of the known world. The Atlantic swell breaks against a coastline older than memory. Cliffs of limestone and granite rise from the sea where the Iberian Peninsula thrusts westward into open ocean, the last mass of land before the waters stretch unbroken toward a horizon no ancient sailor dared to cross. This is the edge of the known world. Behind these cliffs, a land of contrasts unfolds, arid plateaus baked under relentless sun, river valleys thick with oak and wild olive, mountain ranges that trap rain and snow, and southern lowlands where the soil runs red with iron. The peninsula sits at the hinge between 2 seas and 2 continents, and everything that follows in its long history flows from this single geographic fact. Sometime around 1100 years before the Common Era, ships with curved prows and cedar hulls appear off the southern coast. Phoenician merchants from the city of Tyre, already masters of the eastern Mediterranean trade, have pushed beyond the pillars of Hercules seeking metals. They find what they are looking for. The rivers of the south carry alluvial gold. The mountains hold veins of silver, copper, and tin. On a cluster of small islands at the mouth of a tidal channel, these traders establish Gadir, the walled place, a permanent trading post that will endure for millennia as the city now called Cadiz. It is among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in Western Europe. The Phoenicians do not come as conquerors. They come as buyers, intermediaries, and craftsmen. Their harbors are modest, stone quays, warehouses for amphorae of wine and oil, workshops where artisans cast bronze figurines and carve ivory. They trade purple-dyed textiles, glass beads, and perfumed oils for raw metal. Inland, they encounter a civilization already flourishing. The people later sources call Tartessians control the lower Guadalquivir Valley, a kingdom rich enough to enter Greek legend as Tartessos, a place of fabulous wealth. Tartessian metalworkers produce gold jewelry of extraordinary refinement, diadems, belt buckles, earrings worked in granulation and filigree techniques that rival anything in the eastern Mediterranean. Further north and east, the peoples known collectively as Iberians build fortified hilltop settlements, paint elaborate pottery with geometric and animal motifs, and carve stone sculptures of warriors and aristocratic women. The Lady of Elsha, a painted limestone bust dating to the 4th century before the Common Era, gazes outward with an expression of composed authority, her elaborate headdress framing a face both human and hieratic. In the interior highlands, Celtic-speaking peoples intermingle with Iberian populations to form the Celtiberian cultures, pastoral, warlike, organized around fortified towns called castros, their iron weapons and circular shields marking a martial society shaped by the harsh meseta landscape. By the 6th century before the Common Era, Greek colonists from Phocaea establish Emporion on the northeastern coast, creating another node in the web of Mediterranean commerce. But it is Carthage, Phoenicia's greatest colonial offspring, that transforms Iberia's place in the wider world. After losing Sicily to Rome in the First Punic War, Carthage turns west. In 237 before the Common Era, Hamilcar Barca lands in southern Iberia with an army determined to build a new base of power. His son-in-law Hasdrubal founds New Carthage, modern Cartagena, as a fortified capital and silver extraction center. The mines surrounding it produce staggering wealth, funding the army that Hamilcar's son Hannibal will one day lead across the Alps. Rome watches with growing alarm. When Hannibal besieges and destroys Saguntum, a city allied with Rome, in 219 before the Common Era, the Second Punic War erupts. Rome sends legions to Iberia not to conquer it, but to cut Carthage's supply lines. The young general Publius Cornelius Scipio captures New Carthage in a daring assault in 209 before the Common Era. At the Battle of Ilipa in 206, he shatters the remaining Carthaginian forces. Carthage withdraws from Iberia forever. Rome remains, and the peninsula's ancient independence begins its long transformation into something else entirely. The legions do not leave. What begins as a strategic maneuver against Carthage becomes an occupation, and what begins as occupation becomes something far more permanent. A transformation so thorough that within 4 centuries, the peoples of Iberia will have forgotten they were ever anything other than Roman. But the peninsula does not submit easily. The interior highlands, dry and vast, shelter peoples who have never bowed to any foreign power. The Celtiberians of the central Meseta and the Lusitanians of the west fight with a ferocity that stuns Roman commanders. Viriathus, a Lusitanian shepherd turned war leader, wages a guerrilla campaign through the 1150s and 40s before the Common Era that humiliates successive Roman armies. He is assassinated by his own men, bribed by Roman agents, around 139 before the Common Era. The Celtiberian stronghold of Numantia, perched on a hill above the Duero River, resists siege after siege until Scipio Aemilianus encircles it with 7 camps and a wall 9 kilometers long. In 133 before the Common Era, the starving defenders burn their city and themselves rather than surrender. Rome razes what remains to bare earth. With Numantia's fall, organized resistance effectively ends. Rome divides its Iberian territories into Hispania Citerior and Hispania Ulterior, and governors begin the slow work of road building, town founding, and tax collection. Julius Caesar campaigns here, grants citizenship to favored communities. Augustus, after final pacification of the Cantabrians and Asturians in 19 before the Common Era, reorganizes the peninsula into 3 provinces: Tarraconensis in the north and east, Baetica in the south, and Lusitania in the west, each with its own capital, its own governor, its own integration into the imperial system. The transformation is physical. Roads of compacted gravel and fitted stone radiate from Tarraco and Emerita Augusta, connecting mines to ports, legionary camps to administrative centers. The aqueduct of Segovia rises on 167 granite arches without mortar, carrying mountain water across a valley into the city. At Emerita Augusta, modern Merida, a theatre seating 6,000 opens onto a stage framed by Corinthian columns. Amphitheatres, baths, forums, and bridges reshape the landscape from the Pyrenees to the southern coast. The transformation is also cultural. Latin replaces dozens of indigenous tongues within generations. Local elites adopt Roman dress, Roman names, Roman dining customs. Baetica becomes one of the empire's richest provinces, exporting olive oil in distinctive globular amphorae stamped with the names of producers. Millions of these shards accumulate into an artificial hill in Rome itself, Monte Testaccio. Hispania's mines yield gold, silver, copper, tin, and lead in quantities that help finance the imperial treasury. The peninsula gives Rome not merely resources but rulers. Trajan, born in Italica near modern Seville around 53 of the Common Era, becomes emperor in 98, the firstborn outside Italy. His successor Hadrian comes from the same town. Theodosius, who makes Christianity the sole legal religion of the empire with the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, is of Hispanic origin. The philosopher Seneca, the poets Martial and Lucan, the agricultural writer Columella, all are products of Romanized Hispania. Christianity arrives by the 2nd century, spreading along trade routes and through urban communities. By the 4th century, bishops govern from every major city, and church councils at Elvira establish some of the earliest known ecclesiastical canons. When the empire fractures in the 5th century, Hispania's Roman identity does not vanish. It persists in language, in law, in the grid-patterned towns and stone-arched bridges, in the faith preached from basilicas built on Roman foundations. In 409, Vandals, Alans, and Suevi cross the Pyrenees. The Visigoths follow, initially as Roman allies. By 476, when the last Western emperor is deposed in Italy, Hispania has already passed into new hands, but the Roman imprint remains indelible beneath every subsequent layer of history. The Visigoths who settle across the peninsula in the late 5th century are not strangers to Roman ways. They have served as federati, fought alongside legions, absorbed Latin administrative practice, yet they remain a warrior aristocracy ruling over a Hispano-Roman majority, and a theological chasm divides them. The Visigoths profess Arian Christianity, denying the equal divinity of the Son, while their subjects hold to Nicene Catholicism. For more than a century, this fracture weakens the kingdom from within. Toledo becomes the capital, a city perched on a granite bluff above the Tagus, its Roman walls reinforced, its churches multiplying. From here, Visigothic kings govern a realm stretching from the Pyrenees to the southern coasts, from Lusitania to the Mediterranean shore. The monarchy is elective in theory, which breeds chronic instability. Succession crises, aristocratic factions, assassination. Between 476 and 711, more than 30 kings reign, and few die peacefully in their beds. The decisive transformation arrives in 589. At the Third Council of Toledo, King Richard I publicly renounces Arianism and embraces Catholicism, bringing the Visigothic elite into communion with the Hispano-Roman Church. The bishops become pillars of royal authority. Church councils at Toledo function as quasi-legislative assemblies, blending ecclesiastical and secular governance. A shared faith now binds ruler and ruled. Under King Reconstruction in 654, the Liber Judiciorum is promulgated, a comprehensive legal code applied equally to Goths and Romans, replacing the old dual system. It codifies property rights, criminal penalties, judicial procedures. Fragments of this code will survive in Iberian law for centuries. The treasure of Guarazar, votive crowns of hammered gold studded with sapphires and pearls, suspended by golden chains before church altars, testifies to the kingdom's wealth and its fusion of Germanic metalwork with Byzantine splendor. Yet beneath the surface, the kingdom rots. Noble factions contest every succession. Jews face escalating persecution, driven from commerce and public life by successive councils. The military levy weakens as magnates hoard power on their estates. When King Witiza dies around 710, rival claimants tear the realm apart. Into this chaos steps catastrophe. In the spring of 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber commander serving the Umayyad governor of North Africa, Musa ibn Nusayr, crosses the narrow strait with perhaps 7,000 men. They land near the rock that will bear Tariq's name, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. King Roderick, the last Visigothic monarch, marches south from Toledo to meet them. At the Battle of Guadalete in July of 711, Roderick's army disintegrates. Treachery from rival Gothic factions, combined with Berber ferocity, destroys the kingdom's last field army. Roderick vanishes, killed, drowned, or fled, and no organized resistance remains. The speed of conquest astonishes. Within 7 years, Muslim forces sweep through Córdoba, Seville, Toledo, Zaragoza, and reach the Pyrenees. Cities open their gates, local elites negotiate terms. The Visigothic state collapses not from a single blow, but from the absence of any structure capable of rallying after the king falls. By 718, nearly the entire peninsula lies under Muslim control. Only in the far north, the rain-soaked mountains of Asturias, where terrain favors defense and offers little to conquerors, does resistance crystallize. Around 722, a Visigothic nobleman named Pelayo defeats a Muslim raiding force at Covadonga, a narrow valley beneath limestone cliffs. The victory is small, perhaps insignificant to the Umayyad governors in Córdoba, but it preserves a kernel of Christian political authority that will never be extinguished. In Córdoba itself, a new order takes shape. Successive governors rule under the Umayyad caliphs of Damascus until 756, when Abd al-Rahman I, a fugitive prince who survived the Abbasid massacre of his dynasty, arrives in Iberia, defeats the sitting governor, and establishes an independent emirate. The great mosque begins to rise on the site of a Visigothic church, its forest of double arches in red brick and white stone, announcing a civilization that will rival Baghdad in learning and splendor. The peninsula now belongs to two worlds: the Islamic south, flourishing and cosmopolitan, and the Christian north, impoverished but defiant, clinging to mountain strongholds and the memory of a kingdom lost. The independent emirate founded by Abd al-Rahman I grows across 2 centuries into something unprecedented in Western Europe. Córdoba swells to a population that rivals Constantinople. Its streets are paved and lit by oil lamps. Its libraries accumulate hundreds of thousands of volumes, works of Greek philosophy translated into Arabic, treatises on medicine, astronomy, agriculture, and mathematics. Irrigation channels called acequias transform arid valleys into gardens of pomegranate, citrus, and sugarcane. Silk workshops hum in the Albayacin. And in 929, Abd al-Rahman III, having crushed internal rebellions and repelled Fatimid influence from North Africa, proclaims himself caliph, commander of the faithful, severing the last symbolic tie to any Eastern authority. Al-Andalus now stands as a sovereign caliphate. West of Córdoba, the palatial city of Medina Azahara rises on terraced slopes, its reception halls floored in polished marble, its walls carved with vegetal arabesques so intricate they seem to breathe. Ambassadors from Byzantium, the German Empire, and the Christian kingdoms of the north travel here to petition the caliph. The caliphate's mint strikes gold dinars that circulate across the Mediterranean. Its navy patrols from Almeria to the Balearic Islands. For nearly a century, this is the most powerful state in Western Europe. Yet the structure is brittle. When the Chamberlain al-Mansur seizes effective power in 978 and wages devastating summer raids against Christian cities, sacking Barcelona in 985, Santiago de Compostela in 997, he hollows out caliphal legitimacy even as he extends caliphal terror. After his death and the chaos of civil war, the caliphate disintegrates entirely by 1031. In its place emerge more than 30 Taifa kingdoms, petty states ruled by Arab, Berber, or Slavic dynasties, each wealthy in culture but weak in arms. The Taifa courts of Seville, Zaragoza, Toledo, and Granada patronize poets and astronomers, yet they pay tribute in gold to the very Christian kings they once dominated. This fragmentation invites the decisive Christian advance. Alfonso VI of Leon Castile captures Toledo in 1085, the old Visigothic capital, laden with symbolic weight. The Taifa kings, desperate, summon the Almoravids from Morocco. These austere Berber warriors cross the strait, defeat Alfonso at Sagrajas in 1086, then absorb the Taifas themselves. When Almoravid power decays, a second wave follows. The Almohads, rigorous reformers from the Atlas Mountains, unify Islamic Iberia under their banner by 1172. Meanwhile, the Christian north hardens. Castles multiply along the Meseta. The word Castile itself means land of castles. Military orders, Santiago, Calatrava, Alcantara, garrison the frontier, combining monastic discipline with mounted warfare. Aragon expands eastward, taking Zaragoza in 1118. Portugal separates as an independent kingdom in 1139. Navarre holds its Pyrenean passes. The collision comes at Las Navas de Tolosa on July 16, 1212. A coalition of Castilian, Aragonese, Navarrese, and Portuguese forces, reinforced by foreign crusaders, meets the Almohad Caliph al-Nasir on the high plateau of the Sierra Morena. The Christian charge breaks through the Almohad guard. The Caliph's camp falls. Tens of thousands die. Almohad authority in Iberia never recovers. The generation that follows reaps the harvest. Ferdinand III of Castile, later canonized, drives south with relentless momentum. Córdoba, seat of the old caliphate, falls in 1236. Its great mosque is consecrated as a cathedral, though its forest of arches remains untouched. Jaén submits in 1246. And in November of 1248, Seville, the largest city in the peninsula, ringed by Almohad walls and dominated by its great minaret, surrenders after a 16-month siege. The Muslim population is expelled. Ferdinand enters through the Puerta de Jerez. Only the Nasrid kingdom of Granada survives, wedged between the Sierra Nevada and the sea, paying tribute to Castile. Islamic Iberia, which once stretched from the Pyrenees to the Strait, has contracted to a single mountainous enclave. The balance of power on the peninsula has shifted irreversibly northward. The Nasrid Emirate endures behind its mountain walls, but the peninsula's center of gravity now belongs to two Christian kingdoms whose trajectories will converge with world-altering consequence. Castile sprawls across the Meseta, a vast tableland of wheat, sheep, and fortified towns stretching from the Cantabrian coast to the olive groves of Andalusia. Its monarchs command the largest territory in Iberia, its Cortes grants taxation, its military orders, Santiago, Calatrava, Alcantara, hold enormous landed estates won during the Reconquista. Wool from millions of merino sheep flows north through the Mesta Guild to Flemish looms, generating revenue that funds royal ambition. Yet Castile is riven by noble factions. The reign of Henry IV, from 1454 to 1474, descends into civil strife. Grandees question the legitimacy of his daughter Juana, mocking the king's authority in the public farce of Avila, where his effigy is deposed from a wooden throne in 1465. Aragon follows a different logic. Its crown is a confederation. The kingdoms of Aragon, Valencia, and Majorca joined to the Principality of Catalonia, each retaining its own Cortes, its own laws, its own customs barriers. Catalan and Valencian merchants operate across the western Mediterranean, maintaining consulates in Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa. Barcelona's Llotja de Mar hums with commercial contracts. Aragon's monarchy is constrained by pactist tradition. The king rules by negotiation, not decree. The marriage that reshapes Iberian history takes place in Valladolid on the 19th of October, 1469. Isabella, 18 years old and heir presumptive to Castile, weds Ferdinand, 17 and heir to Aragon. The union is personal, not institutional. Each crown retains its separate laws, currencies, and administrations. But the political will behind it is singular. When Isabella claims the Castilian throne in 1474 upon Henry's death, she faces 4 years of civil war against Juana's supporters and their Portuguese allies. Victory at the Battle of Toro in 1476 secures her position. Together, the Catholic monarchs, a title Pope Alexander VI will formally grant in 1494, systematically dismantle noble disorder. They revive the Santa Hermandad, a rural police force, to suppress banditry. They reclaim royal lands alienated during decades of aristocratic chaos. They place the military orders under crown control. The Council of Castile becomes the supreme governing body, staffed by university-trained letrados rather than feudal lords. In 1478, a papal bull authorizes the Spanish Inquisition, not a Roman institution, but a crown-controlled tribunal charged with ensuring the orthodoxy of conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, suspected of practicing their former faith in secret. Tomás de Torquemada becomes Grand Inquisitor in 1483. The Inquisition's jurisdiction expands steadily, its auto da fe ceremonies projecting religious conformity as state policy. Then comes the final campaign. In 1482, war resumes against Granada. For 10 years, Castilian armies reduce Nasrid fortresses one by one, Ronda in 1485, Malaga in 1487, Baza in 1489. On the 2nd of January 1492, Muhammad XII surrenders the keys of the Alhambra. The red and gold banner of Castile rises above the Comares Tower. 780 years of Islamic political presence in Iberia end in a single ceremony. Within weeks, the monarchs signed the Alhambra Decree on the 31st of March, expelling all professing Jews from their kingdoms within 4 months. Perhaps 200,000 people face conversion or exile. Communities that have inhabited Iberia for over a millennium dissolve overnight. And on the 3rd of August, 1492, 3 small vessels, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, slip out of the harbour at Palos de la Frontera on the Tinto River, carrying a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus westward under Castilian contract. The crown that has just completed its continental reconquest now reaches, almost without pause, toward an ocean whose far shore no European has mapped. A kingdom forged in 8 centuries of religious war stands at the threshold of global empire. The 3 vessels cross the Atlantic in 33 days. On the 12th of October, 1492, a lookout aboard the Pinta sights land, a low coral island in the Bahamas that its Lucayan inhabitants call Guanahani. Columbus names it San Salvador, plants a royal banner in the sand, and claims it for Castile. He has not reached Asia. He does not know this. The first voyage touches Cuba and Hispaniola before the Santa Maria runs aground on a reef off the northern coast of the larger island on Christmas Day. Columbus builds a small fort from the wreckage, La Navidad, leaves 39 men behind, and returns to Spain with gold trinkets, parrots, and several captive Taino people as proof of discovery. Ferdinand and Isabella receive him in Barcelona with full honours in the spring of 1493. The second voyage departs that September with 17 ships and over 1,200 men, soldiers, farmers, priests, craftsmen. They find La Navidad burned, its garrison dead. Columbus founds a new settlement, Isabella, on Hispaniola's north coast. It fails within 2 years. Disease, hunger, indigenous resistance, and Spanish infighting plague every attempt at permanent colonization. Columbus governs poorly, resorting to brutal punishments against both Taino and colonists. He makes 2 further voyages, reaching Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, and the coast of Central America, but never finds the Asian courts he seeks. By 1504, stripped of his governorship and broken in health, he returns to Spain for the last time. Yet the machinery of colonization grinds forward without him. In 1494, Spain and Portugal sign the Treaty of Tordesillas, drawing a meridian 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything west belongs to Castile, everything east to Portugal. A line on parchment divides a world neither power has seen. On Hispaniola, Nicolas de Ovando arrives as governor in 1502 with 2,500 settlers. He imposes the encomienda system, grants of indigenous labor to Spanish colonists in exchange for supposed Christian instruction. In practice, the Taino are worked to death in gold mines and fields. Their population, perhaps several 100,000 at contact, collapses within 2 decades from forced labor, starvation, and epidemic diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, against which they carry no immunity. A young priest named Bartolomé de las Casas, who arrives in 1502 and initially holds an encomienda himself, begins witnessing atrocities that will transform him into the most persistent critic of Spanish colonial violence. Settlement spreads outward. Juan Ponce de León occupies Puerto Rico in 1508. Jamaica falls under Spanish control. Diego Velázquez de Cuéllar conquers Cuba between 1511 and 1514, establishing Havana and Santiago. Each island becomes a staging ground for the next thrust forward. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa leads a small expedition across the dense jungle of the Isthmus of Darien. On the 25th of September, he climbs a peak on the Cordillera and becomes the first European to sight the Pacific Ocean from the Americas. He wades into its waters in full armor, sword raised, claiming it and all lands it touches for the crown of Castile. The discovery confirms that an entire ocean, and presumably Asia beyond it, lies west of these new lands. The Caribbean settlements remain precarious, violent, and dependent on indigenous labor that is rapidly vanishing. The gold of Hispaniola runs thin. Ambitious men look towards the mainland, where rumors speak of wealthy civilizations in the interior. Pedrarias Dávila governs Darien with notorious cruelty, eventually executing Balboa in 1519 on fabricated charges of treason. That same February of 1519, Hernán Cortés, a minor hidalgo turned Cuban landowner, defies Governor Velázquez's orders and sails from the island with 11 ships, roughly 600 men, 16 horses, and a handful of small cannon. He steers toward the Yucatan coast, where earlier expeditions have reported stone cities and gold. The age of Caribbean footholds is ending. The age of continental conquest is about to begin. Behind Cortés, the islands lie devastated, their original peoples nearly gone, their gold exhausted, their function reduced to way stations for a far larger ambition now taking shape on the horizon of a continent no European yet comprehends. Cortés lands on the Gulf Coast near present-day Veracruz in the spring of 1519 and immediately burns his ships, or more precisely, scuttles them, stripping their fittings and boring holes in their hulls so that no man among his company can contemplate retreat. The gesture is calculated. He founds the town of Villarrica de la Vera Cruz, establishes a municipal council loyal to him rather than to Governor Velázquez, and claims authority directly from the crown. Then he turns inland, climbing from the humid lowlands into the volcanic highlands of central Mexico, toward a city his Totonac informants describe as the greatest in the world. Tenochtitlan sits on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways. Its population approaches 200,000, larger than any city in Spain. Temples rise in stepped pyramids above a grid of canals and markets. The Mexica Emperor Moctezuma II rules a tributary empire stretching from coast to coast, but it is an empire of resentment. Subject peoples pay crushing tribute in goods, labor, and sacrificial captives. Cortés exploits this fracture with precision. At Tlaxcala, a fiercely independent republic that has resisted Mexica domination for generations, he fights brief engagements and then negotiates alliance. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors join his column. In November of 1519, the Spaniards enter Tenochtitlan as guests. Within days, Cortés seizes Moctezuma as a hostage. The arrangement holds for months in uneasy tension until June of 1520, when Spanish soldiers massacre Mexican nobles during a religious festival at the Templo Mayor. The city erupts. Moctezuma dies, whether by Spanish hands or stones thrown by his own people remains disputed. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spaniards flee along the Tlacopan causeway under a hail of projectiles, losing perhaps half their men and most of their gold. They call it the Noche Triste. But Cortés regroups at Tlaxcala. He builds 13 brigantines, carries them overland in pieces, and launches them on Lake Texcoco. For 75 days through the summer of 1521, his forces and tens of thousands of indigenous allies besiege the island city, cutting its aqueducts, blocking its causeways, and fighting house by house through rubble. Smallpox, introduced months earlier by a single infected African slave in the expedition of Pánfilo de Narváez, ravages the defenders. The last emperor, Cuauhtémoc, surrenders on August 13, 1521. Tenochtitlan lies in ruins. Upon its wreckage, the Spaniards will build Mexico City. A decade later, the pattern repeats on an even vaster scale. Francisco Pizarro, a veteran of Balboa's expedition, sails south along the Pacific coast with fewer than 200 men. The Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, stretches 4,000 kilometers along the Andes, governing perhaps 10 million people through an intricate system of roads, storehouses, and quipu record-keeping. But a succession war between the brothers Atahualpa and Huasca has just torn the empire apart. On November 16, 1532, Pizarro lures Atahualpa into the plaza of Cajamarca and springs an ambush. Cannon and cavalry slaughter thousands of unarmed attendants. The emperor is captured alive. He offers a room filled with gold and 2 rooms of silver for his release. Pizarro accepts the ransom, then executes Atahualpa in July of 1533. Cusco falls that November. Within a decade, Spanish expeditions fan outward. Pedro de Valdivia into Chile, Gonzalo Pizarro into the Amazon basin, Hernando de Soto into the interior of North America. Disease precedes them everywhere. Measles, typhus, influenza, and above all smallpox sweep through populations with no immunity. Demographic estimates vary, but across the 16th century, the indigenous population of the Americas may decline by 90%. In 1542, responding to decades of protest by missionaries like Bartolomé de las Casas, Charles V promulgates the new laws, attempting to abolish indigenous slavery and phase out the encomienda. Colonial settlers resist violently. In Peru, encomenderos rebel and murder the viceroy. Enforcement proves uneven. But the legal framework signals a crown determined to assert sovereignty over its own conquistadors, even as the human cost of conquest continues to mount across 2 shattered continents. The young king who arrives in Spain in 1517 speaks no Castilian. Charles of Ghent, born in the Burgundian Netherlands in 1500, raised among Flemish courtiers and tutored in French, inherits the Spanish crowns upon the death of his maternal grandfather Ferdinand in 1516. He is just 16 years old. His mother Juana, deemed unfit to rule, remains confined at Tordesillas. The Castilian Cortes grudgingly acknowledge him at Valladolid in 1518, but resentment simmers. This foreign prince surrounds himself with Burgundian advisers, appoints a Flemish regent, and extracts Castilian silver to fund his election as Holy Roman Emperor. When he departs for Germany in 1520 to claim the imperial title as Charles V, the cities of Castile explode. The Comuneros revolt erupts in Toledo, Segovia, Salamanca, and a dozen other towns across the Meseta. Urban oligarchies and middling hidalgos demand that the king reside in Castile, appoint only Castilian officials, and halt the export of bullion. For nearly a year, the Comunero junta governed central Castile in open defiance of royal authority. But the movement fractures along class lines. When radical elements threaten noble estates, the grandees rally to the crown. At Villalar on the 23rd of April, 1521, royalist cavalry crushes the Comunero army on rain-soaked fields. The leaders, Padilla, Bravo, Maldonado, are beheaded the following morning. Castile submits, and Charles learns a lesson he never forgets. He must govern Spain as a Spaniard. He returns, learns the language, marries the Portuguese Infanta Isabella, and makes Spain the financial and military heart of his empire. That empire is staggering in scope. Through Habsburg inheritance alone, Charles rules the Low Countries, Franche-Comté, Austria, and claims over Bohemia and Hungary. As Holy Roman Emperor, he presides over the German princes. Through Aragon, he holds Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia. Through Castile, he commands the Americas and their silver. No single ruler since Charlemagne has wielded such authority across Christendom, and none has faced so many simultaneous threats. Francis I of France, encircled by Habsburg territory, wages 4 wars against Charles between 1521 and 1544. At Pavia on the 24th of February, 1525, Spanish tercios and imperial forces shatter the French army and capture Francis himself. The French king spends a year imprisoned in Madrid. Yet victory brings no peace. France allies with the Ottoman Empire, and Suleiman the Magnificent presses into Hungary, crushing the Hungarians at Mohacs in 1526 and besieging Vienna itself in 1529. Simultaneously, the Protestant Reformation tears the empire's religious unity apart. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, Martin Luther refuses to recant before Charles. The emperor issues the Edict of Worms condemning Luther, but German princes embrace the new faith for reasons both spiritual and political. Charles cannot crush them. He needs their troops against the Ottomans and the French. In 1527, his unpaid imperial troops mutiny and sack Rome itself, holding Pope Clement VII hostage for months. The defender of Catholicism becomes, briefly, the Pope's jailer. Decades of war across 4 fronts, France, the Ottomans, the Protestant princes, and North African corsairs, drain even the rivers of American silver. Charles declares bankruptcy in 1557, though the financial collapse begins before his formal abdication. Gout-ridden, exhausted, aged beyond his 56 years, he stages an extraordinary ceremony in Brussels on the 25th of October, 1555. Before assembled nobles, he transfers the Netherlands to his son Philip. In January 1556, he cedes Spain, its Italian possessions, and the Americas to Philip as well. His brother Ferdinand receives Austria and the imperial title. Charles retires to the monastery of Yuste in Extremadura, where he dies on the 21st of September, 1558. The universal monarchy he attempted proves impossible for one man to sustain, but the Spanish portion his son inherits remains the most powerful state on earth. Philip inherits a machine of governance so vast that no single court can contain it. From the moment he assumes power in 1556, the new king chooses a different method than his father's restless itinerancy. He will rule from a fixed center, through paper, through patience, through the relentless accumulation of information. And in the granite foothills of the Sierra de Guadarrama, 45 kilometers northwest of Madrid, he begins constructing the monument that will embody his reign. The Real Monasterio de San Lorenzo de El Escorial rises from 1563 onward, a grid of grey stone stretching 207 meters along its main facade, housing a basilica, a royal palace, a monastery, a library, a seminary, and a royal mausoleum within a single rectangular plan. Juan Bautista de Toledo designs the initial scheme. After his death, Juan de Herrera completes it in 1584. The structure is austere, mathematical, stripped of ornament, a deliberate rejection of the exuberance that characterizes other European courts. Philip governs from a small study adjacent to the basilica's high altar, reading dispatches from Manila, Lima, Brussels, Naples, and Mexico City, annotating them in his careful hand, returning decisions through the same postal networks that bind his empire together. That empire now spans the globe. In 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi establishes Spanish sovereignty over the Philippine archipelago, named decades earlier in honor of the then prince. Manila becomes the western terminus of the trans-Pacific galleon trade, linking Asian silk and porcelain to American silver. From Acapulco to Seville, from Potosí to Antwerp, Spanish commerce circles the earth. Yet the most immediate threat lies in the Mediterranean. Ottoman naval power menaces the western basin, raids Italian and Spanish coasts, and threatens Christendom's southern flank. On the 7th of October, 1571, a combined fleet of the Holy League, Spain, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, and smaller allies meets the Ottoman armada at Lepanto in the Gulf of Patras. Over 200 Allied galleys engage roughly the same number of Ottoman vessels. The battle lasts 5 hours. The Ottoman fleet loses nearly 200 ships captured or sunk. The victory does not destroy Ottoman naval capacity permanently, but it shatters the myth of Turkish invincibility at sea and secures the western Mediterranean for Christian powers. 9 years later, Philip achieves his most dramatic territorial gain without a major battle. When King Sebastian of Portugal dies without an heir at Alcácer-Quibir in 1578, Philip, grandson of the Portuguese King Manuel I through his mother, presses his dynastic claim. In 1580, the Duke of Alba leads Spanish forces into Portugal. The Cortes of Tomar recognizes Philip as king, and Portugal's global empire, Brazil, Goa, Malacca, Macau, Mozambique, Angola, falls under the same crown. The sun now literally never sets on Philip's dominions. But the northern provinces of the Netherlands have been in open revolt since 1568, resisting Spanish taxation, religious persecution of Calvinists, and centralized governance. The Duke of Alba's Council of Troubles executes thousands. William of Orange leads resistance that hardens into permanent separation. By the 1580s, the 7 northern provinces form the Union of Utrecht and declare independence. England under Elizabeth supports the Dutch rebels and licenses privateers against Spanish shipping. Philip assembles the Gran Armada, roughly 130 vessels carrying perhaps 30,000 men, to invade England in 1588. English fireships scatter the fleet off Gravelines. Storms drive the remnants around Scotland and Ireland. Perhaps half the ships return to Spain. The invasion fails utterly. Philip declares bankruptcy 4 times during his reign, in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, yet the silver keeps flowing and the wars continue. He dies at the Escorial on the 13th of September, 1598, after months of agonizing illness surrounded by relics and prayers. He leaves his son Philip III an empire still immense but financially exhausted, militarily overstretched, and locked in unwinnable conflicts across 3 continents. The granite palace endures, silent, ordered, monumental, a perfect expression of the will that held this impossible dominion together through force of administration alone. The mountain rises above the Altiplano like a perfect cone, its slopes the color of dried blood. Cerro Rico, the rich hill, stands over the settlement of Potosi at an altitude of more than 4,000 meters, where the air thins and breath comes short. Inside its flanks, a labyrinth of tunnels bores deeper with each passing decade. Indigenous laborers, conscripted under the meter system inherited and formalized from Inca precedent, descend into shafts so narrow they must crawl, carrying candles between their teeth, hauling ore in leather sacks on their backs up ladders made of braided hide. Thousands enter these tunnels each week. Not all emerge. Discovered in 1545, Potosi becomes within a generation the largest source of silver on earth and one of the most populous cities in the world. By 1600, its population rivals that of London or Paris, perhaps 160,000 souls crowded onto the freezing plateau. The silver extracted here does not stay. It flows downward through mule trains to the Pacific port of Arica, then northward by ship to Lima, or overland to the Atlantic coast at Buenos Aires. From there it crosses the ocean in armed convoys, the famous flotas and galeones, bound for Seville. The fleet system operates with bureaucratic precision. Twice yearly convoys depart from Seville under armed escort. The flota sails to Veracruz in New Spain, the galeones to Nombre de Dios, and later Portobello on the Isthmus of Panama. At great trade fairs, colonial silver and gold are exchanged for European manufactured goods, textiles, iron tools, wine, paper, mercury for amalgamation processing. The returning fleets converge at Havana before crossing the Atlantic together, their holds heavy with bullion stamped by royal mints in Mexico City, Potosi, and Lima. The Casa de Contratación in Seville registers every cargo, collects the royal fifth, the quinto real, and attempts to regulate all commerce with the Indies. Yet silver does not enrich Spain alone. It passes through Castilian hands to Genoese bankers, Flemish merchants, and German creditors who finance the crown's perpetual wars. Much of it flows onward to China through the Manila galleon, the extraordinary trade route established in 1565, linking Acapulco to Manila across the Pacific. Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices cross westward. American silver crosses eastward, feeding Ming and later Qing dynasty demand for the metal. A single galleon might carry 2 million pesos in silver on each annual voyage. The Council of the Indies in Madrid governs this vast system from above, appointing viceroys, audiencia judges, corregidores, and bishops. 2 viceroyalties structure the empire: New Spain, governed from Mexico City, and Peru, governed from Lima. Below the administrators, colonial society arranges itself in rigid hierarchy. Peninsulares, those born in Spain, hold the highest offices. Criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas dominate land ownership and local commerce, but resent their exclusion from top positions. Below them, mestizos, indigenous communities organized into reducciones, and enslaved Africans laboring on Caribbean sugar plantations and Pacific coastal haciendas form the broad base of the social pyramid. Casta paintings of the 18th century will attempt to classify every possible mixture of ancestry into named categories, an obsession with blood purity inherited from the Reconquista. Amid this extraction, a civilization takes form. Baroque churches rise in every colonial city, their facades carved in soft volcanic stone, their interiors blazing with gold leaf applied over cedar altarpieces. The University of Mexico, founded in 1551, and San Marcos in Lima train lawyers, theologians, and physicians. Printing presses operate in Mexico City from 1539. Indigenous artisans blend European forms with pre-Columbian motifs, creating a syncretic visual culture visible in the angel musicians of Calamarca, the feathered virgins of Andean painting, the polychrome tiles of Puebla. The colonial machine functions, extracting, shipping, governing, converting, for a century and a half with remarkable continuity. But its foundation is human labor under coercion, and its wealth flows outward, leaving the empire rich in territory yet perpetually indebted. Its silver financing other nations' rise, while its own productive economy stagnates beneath the weight of precious metal that paradoxically impoverishes the land that possesses it. Philip III inherits the most powerful throne on earth in 1598, yet he is the first Spanish king to surrender the daily labor of governance entirely to another man. The Duke of Lerma, his valido, rules in all but name, relocating the court to Valladolid for 5 years, enriching his own family, negotiating the 12 years' truce with the Dutch rebels in 1609 because the treasury can no longer sustain the army of Flanders. The truce is an admission. 80 years of war in the Netherlands have consumed more silver than Potosi can yield. Castile's villages empty. The Meseta, once the demographic heartland of the monarchy, loses perhaps a quarter of its population between 1580 and 1640. Plague, emigration to the colonies, expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609, and simple exhaustion. Fields lie fallow. Wool production declines. The Crown declares bankruptcy in 1607, converting short-term debts to long-term bonds that creditors accept only at ruinous discounts. Philip IV ascends in 1621, and his valido, the Count Duke of Olivares, possesses the energy his master lacks. Olivares dreams of restoring Spanish primacy through his Union of Arms, a plan to compel every kingdom in the composite monarchy to contribute soldiers and taxes proportionally. Aragon resists. Catalonia resists. Portugal, yoked to the Spanish crown since 1580, seethes. When Castilian troops are billeted in Catalonia during the war against France, Catalan peasants revolt in June 1640, the Corpus de Sang. That same December, Portuguese nobles proclaim the Duke of Braganza as King John IV. The Iberian Union shatters. Portugal will fight for its independence until Spain formally recognizes it in 1668. The 30 Years' War drains what remains. Spanish tercios, once invincible, meet defeat at Rocroi in May 1643. French cavalry breaking the infantry squares that had dominated European battlefields for a century and a half. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 compels Spain to recognize Dutch independence, ending the 80 Years' War with nothing gained. Bankruptcy strikes again in 1647, 1653, 1662, and 1680. Yet inside this contracting empire, art reaches an intensity that seems to feed on crisis. Diego Velázquez paints in the Alcazar of Madrid, his brush capturing the royal family in Las Meninas with a complexity of gaze and light that no European painter has attempted. Zurbarán renders monks in ecstatic prayer, their white robes glowing against absolute darkness. Murillo fills Sevillian churches with tender Madonnas. On the stage, Calderón de la Barca explores honor, illusion, and fate in plays performed at the Buen Retiro Palace, built by Olivares as a theatre of royal magnificence, even as the state crumbles around it. Cervantes had already published Don Quixote in 1605, giving Castilian prose its supreme monument, a novel about a man who cannot accept that the age of heroism has passed. Charles II, born in 1661, embodies the dynasty's exhaustion. Generations of Habsburg intermarriage have left him physically frail, intellectually limited, and unable to produce an heir. His jaw is so malformed he can barely chew. Court factions maneuver for decades over the succession. French Bourbons, Austrian Habsburgs, and Bavarian Wittelsbachs all press claims. Charles lingers, his kingdom governed by regents and confessors until the 1st of November, 1700, when he dies in the Alcazar of Madrid. His will names Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as universal heir. Within weeks, French troops escort the young prince toward Madrid. The great powers of Europe refuse to accept a Bourbon on the Spanish throne unchallenged. War is inevitable, a war that will strip Spain of every European possession beyond the peninsula itself and close the Habsburg chapter forever. The 16-year-old Philip of Anjou enters Madrid in February of 1701, greeted by crowds who see in his youth a promise of renewal. He speaks French, dresses in the fashion of Versailles, and carries with him the administrative instincts of his grandfather Louis XIV. But Europe will not permit the union of French and Spanish power without a fight. By 1702, a grand alliance of England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and most German states declares war on the Bourbon succession. The conflict engulfs the continent for 13 years. Spain itself fractures. Castile supports Philip. But the crown of Aragon, Catalonia, Valencia, the Balearics, declares for the Austrian claimant, Archduke Charles. The reasons run deep. Aragon's ancient fueros, its separate cortes, its jealously guarded liberties, all feel threatened by a centralizing French-style monarchy. Catalonia opens its ports to Allied fleets. Barcelona becomes the Habsburg pretenders' capital in 1705. For nearly a decade, two kings claim the same throne, and Spanish armies fight Spanish armies across the peninsula. The turning point comes at Almansa in April of 1707, where a Franco-Spanish force under the Duke of Berwick crushes the Allied army in Valencia. Philip's generals sweep through Aragon and Valencia. The king's response is immediate and transformative. The Decretos de Nueva Planta, issued for Valencia and Aragon in 1707, abolish their separate legal systems, cortes, and privileges. Castilian law, Castilian language in administration, Castilian institutions now govern the eastern kingdoms. It is the most radical centralization in Iberian history. The composite monarchy of the Habsburgs replaced by a unitary state modeled on France. The war drags on. Madrid itself falls briefly to Allied forces in 1706 and again in 1710. But Philip retains Castilian loyalty, and when the Archduke Charles unexpectedly inherits the Austrian throne in 1711, the Allies lose their appetite for placing him on Spain's throne as well. That would recreate the empire of Charles V. Peace negotiations begin. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 strips Spain of its European empire. The Spanish Netherlands pass to Austria, as do Milan, Naples, Sardinia, and Sicily. Gibraltar and Minorca go to Britain. Spain retains only the peninsula and its vast American and Pacific territories. Barcelona holds out alone, abandoned by its allies. On September 11, 1714, Bourbon forces storm the city after a 14-month siege. Catalan resistance ends in blood. The Nueva Planta decree for Catalonia follows in 1716, erasing the last of the old Aragonese constitutional order. Philip V reigns until 1746, tormented by melancholy so severe he sometimes refuses to rise from bed for months. Yet his administration reshapes Spain. French-trained intendants replace the old viceregal system in the peninsula. A new royal palace rises in Madrid after fire destroys the old Alcazar in 1734. Its white limestone and granite facades proclaim Bourbon grandeur. His son Ferdinand VI rules a decade of peace, rebuilding the treasury. But it is Ferdinand's half-brother Charles III, arriving from Naples in 1759, who becomes the great reforming monarch. Charles transforms Madrid. New sewers, paved streets, gas lanterns, the Prado promenade, monumental gates. He appoints enlightened ministers, the Counts of Aranda, Campomanes, Florida Blanca, who attack the privileges of the church and nobility. In 1767, Charles expels the Jesuits from every Spanish territory, seizing their vast properties, colleges, and missions from Paraguay to the Philippines. In the Americas, he creates intendancies to bypass corrupt local officials, opens new ports to colonial trade beyond Seville and Cadiz, and reorganizes the military. Revenue from the colonies increases sharply. Spain aids the American Revolution against Britain, recovering Florida in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. When Charles III dies in 1788, he leaves a Spain more centralized, more rational in its administration, and more prosperous than at any point since the 16th century. The Bourbon Reformation has remade the state. Yet the very efficiency of centralization has also stripped away the old buffers, the regional liberties, the church's mediating power, the aristocratic counterweights that once absorbed political shocks. The monarchy now depends entirely on the competence of whoever wears the crown. And the next king, Charles IV, possesses none of his father's discipline. Charles IV ascends the throne in 1788, with neither the intellect nor the will to govern. Within months, revolution erupts in France, and the old certainties of Bourbon kinship across the Pyrenees dissolve in blood. Spain initially joins the coalition against revolutionary France, but defeats along the Pyrenean frontier force a humiliating peace at Basel in 1795. The man who negotiates that peace, Manuel de Godoy, a 28-year-old royal favorite widely rumored to be the Queen's lover, becomes the true power behind the throne. Godoy reverses alliances entirely, binding Spain to France through the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1796. The consequences are immediate and devastating. Britain, now Spain's enemy, begins preying on colonial shipping. the silver lifeline from the Americas thins to a trickle. The full price comes due on the morning of October 21st, 1805, off Cape Trafalgar. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet under Villeneuve meets Horatio Nelson's columns. By nightfall, Spain has lost 11 ships of the line. The navy that once commanded 2 oceans ceases to exist as a strategic force. The Atlantic now belongs to Britain, and Spain's colonies lie exposed, connected to the metropole by little more than habit and loyalty. Napoleon, no longer needing Spanish ships, turns his appetite toward the peninsula itself. In 1807, French troops cross into Spain under the pretext of invading Portugal. By March of 1808, over 100,000 French soldiers occupy key Spanish cities. The population watches with growing fury. On March 19th, a mob at Aranjuez forces Charles IV to abdicate in favor of his son Ferdinand VII. Napoleon summons both to Bayonne, extracts abdications from each, and installs his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne in June. Madrid explodes on May 2, 1808. Civilians armed with knives and kitchen implements attack Mameluke cavalry in the Puerta del Sol. Marshal Murat's reprisals the following dawn, firing squads against a whitewashed wall, lanterns casting long shadows over crumpled bodies, become the scene Francisco de Goya will immortalize. The uprising spreads across Spain within weeks. Provincial juntas declare loyalty to the absent Ferdinand and organize resistance. At Bailen in July, a Spanish force under General Castaños surrounds and captures an entire French corps, the first open-field defeat of a Napoleonic army. Napoleon responds personally, crossing the Pyrenees with 200,000 veterans in November. He retakes Madrid by December. But the war refuses to end. The Spanish regular army, shattered in pitched battle, dissolves into guerrilla bands, small mobile groups that ambush supply columns, cut communications, and vanish into sierra and forest. The word itself, guerrilla, enters the world's vocabulary from these mountains. French garrisons hold cities. The countryside belongs to no one and everyone. Meanwhile, in the besieged port city of Cadiz, the one major city French forces never take, delegates from across the Spanish world convene the Cortes in 1810. On March 19, 1812, they promulgate a constitution that abolishes the Inquisition, establishes press freedom, declares national sovereignty, and creates a constitutional monarchy. It is the most radical liberal document in Europe at that moment, yet its authority remains theoretical while French armies occupy the land. Across the Atlantic, the vacuum of legitimate royal power ignites revolution. In 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo raises the cry of independence in Mexico. In 1811, Venezuelan Creoles declare a republic. Buenos Aires establishes its own junta. The movements are uneven, often crushed and revived, but the pattern is irreversible. When Ferdinand VII returns to Madrid in 1814 and abolishes the Cadiz constitution, restoring absolutism, he drives colonial liberals toward permanent separation. Simón Bolívar campaigns across Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. José de San Martín crosses the Andes into Chile and sails north to Lima. On December 9, 1824, the Battle of Ayacucho in the Peruvian highlands destroys the last royalist army of significance. By 1826, every mainland colony from Mexico to Argentina has broken free. 3 centuries of American empire end not in a single catastrophe, but in a cascade of fractures, each one enabled by that original rupture of 1808, when Napoleon shattered the crown and the pieces scattered beyond recovery. Spain in 1826 is a kingdom without an empire, or nearly so. Ferdinand VII rules as absolute monarch over a peninsula exhausted by war, its treasury hollow, its prestige shattered. Yet the crown still holds Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, scattered Pacific islands, and footholds along the African coast. These remnants, sugar, tobacco, Manila hemp, and strategic harbors, become the final justification for Spain's claim to great power status. The question that haunts the next 7 decades is whether a fractured, unstable metropole can hold even these possessions against the tides of liberalism, nationalism, and American ambition. Ferdinand dies in 1833, leaving his infant daughter Isabella as heir. His brother Carlos claims the throne, insisting that Salic law bars female succession. The First Carlist War erupts, not merely a dynastic quarrel, but a conflict between two Spains. Carlist cavalry rides under the banner of tradition, absolutism, and regional fueros in the Basque country, Navarre, Aragon, and Catalonia. The liberal constitutional forces rally behind the regent Maria Cristina and the generals who defend Isabella's claim. For 7 years, columns of infantry march through mountain passes and burn villages. The Convention of Vergara in 1839 ends the main conflict, but Carlism never truly dies. A second war flares from 1846 to 1849, and a third from 1872 to 1876. Each iteration deepens the wound between clerical traditionalist Spain and liberal urban Spain. Between these convulsions, governments rise and fall with dizzying speed. Generals, Espartero, Narvaez, O'Donnell, Prim, make and unmake ministries through pronunciamientos. Isabella II reigns from 1843 until the Revolution of 1868 drives her into exile. A brief constitutional monarchy under Amadeo of Savoy collapses in 1873. The First Republic lasts 11 months before military intervention restores the Bourbons in the person of Alfonso XII in 1874. Antonio Cánovas del Castillo architects the Restoration system, a constitutional monarchy in which two parties, liberal and conservative, alternate in power through managed elections. The Turno Pacifico brings surface stability, but rests on caciquismo, the manipulation of rural votes by local bosses. Madrid's boulevards widen, railways stretch across the meseta, and Catalan textile mills hum with industrial energy. Yet beneath this veneer, Spain fails to industrialize broadly, and the peasantry remains impoverished. Meanwhile, Cuba simmers. The 10 Years' War begins in 1868, when Carlos Manuel de Céspedes frees his slaves and declares independence. Spain pours 200,000 troops onto the island over a decade, winning a Pyrrhic peace in 1878. Slavery is not abolished in Cuba until 1886. Resentment festers. In 1895, José Martí lands on Cuban soil, and the final insurrection ignites. Spain sends General Valeriano Weyler, whose reconcentration policy herds rural populations into fortified towns, killing tens of thousands through disease and starvation. The United States, its press inflamed and its strategic interests engaged, demands reform. On February 15, 1898, the battleship Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. By April, war is declared. The conflict is brief and devastating. On July 3rd, the Spanish squadron at Santiago de Cuba steams out of the harbor and is annihilated within hours. Every vessel sunk or beached. In the Philippines, Commodore Dewey destroys the Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay on May 1st. Spain has no navy left. The Treaty of Paris, signed December 10th, 1898, cedes Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. 4 centuries of overseas empire end in a document drafted in a foreign capital. The disaster convulses Spanish intellectual life. In Salamanca, in Madrid, cafes, in Barcelona, literary journals, writers and thinkers, Miguel de Unamuno, José Ortega y Gasset in the next generation, Pío Baroja, Antonio Machado, ask what Spain is, what it has become, whether it can regenerate itself from within. The generation of 98 does not offer political programs so much as a spiritual autopsy of a nation that once commanded half the world and now governs only itself, uncertain even of that. The question that haunts the first decades of the 20th century is whether Spain can reinvent itself from within, or whether the tensions of class, region, religion, and military pride will tear it apart before any regeneration takes hold. The young King Alfonso XIII assumes personal rule in 1902, inheriting a constitutional monarchy whose parliament functions through the Turno Pacifico, a managed rotation of liberal and conservative parties that excludes workers, peasants, and regionalists from meaningful power. Beneath this elegant fiction, pressure builds. Anarchist bombs explode in Barcelona. Landless laborers in Andalusia stage desperate strikes. Catalan industrialists demand autonomy. And in Morocco, where Spain holds a narrow protectorate along the Rif coast, colonial war devours conscripts drawn overwhelmingly from the poor. The Rif War proves catastrophic. In July of 1921, Berber forces under Abd el-Krim annihilate a Spanish column at Annual. Between 8,000 and 13,000 soldiers die in a single disaster. The scandal rocks Madrid. Parliamentary commissions investigate. Blame spreads upward toward the king himself, and the army seethes with humiliation and rage. On September 13, 1923, Captain General Miguel Primo de Rivera stages a coup with Alfonso's tacit consent. The constitution is suspended. Primo de Rivera rules by decree, promising order, modernization, and national dignity. He builds roads, dams, and the Ibero-American Exposition in Seville, but his economic policies falter when the global depression strikes. By January of 1930, exhausted and without support, he resigns and dies in exile weeks later. Alfonso attempts to restore constitutional normality, but municipal elections on April 12, 1931, deliver an overwhelming Republican victory in every major city. 2 days later, on April 14th, the Second Republic is proclaimed. Alfonso departs without formal abdication, driving to the coast and boarding a ship. No blood is shed. Crowds fill the Puerta del Sol waving tricolor flags, red, yellow, and purple. The Republic's ambitions are immense. The Constitution of 1931 separates church and state, grants women's suffrage, authorizes regional autonomy for Catalonia, and mandates agrarian reform. Yet implementation proves agonizing. Landowners resist redistribution. The church hierarchy views secularization as persecution. The Army Officer Corps watches with suspicion. Anarchist unions reject parliamentary politics entirely. By 1933, a rightist coalition wins elections and reverses reforms. the so-called Black Biennium. A workers' uprising in Asturias in October 1934 is crushed by colonial troops under General Francisco Franco. The repression radicalizes the left. In February 1936, the Popular Front, a coalition of Republicans, Socialists, and Communists, wins a narrow electoral victory. Spain polarizes beyond recovery. Political assassinations multiply. On July 17th, army garrisons in Spanish Morocco revolt. The uprising spreads to the peninsula the following day. Where it succeeds, Seville, Burgos, Zaragoza, Navarre, nationalist Spain consolidates under a junta that soon elevates Franco to supreme command. Where it fails, Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Bilbao, the Republic holds, armed by hastily distributed weapons and worker militias. The war lasts nearly 3 years. Germany sends the Condor Legion. Italy dispatches tens of thousands of troops and aircraft. The Republic receives Soviet tanks, advisors, and the volunteer international brigades, idealists from over 50 nations who fight at Jarama, Brunete, and the Ebro. On April 26, 1937, German bombers obliterate the Basque town of Guernica in a 3-hour raid that kills hundreds of civilians and shocks the world. Barcelona falls on January 26, 1939. Madrid, besieged since November 1936, surrenders at last on March 28. On April 1, 1939, Franco issues his final war communique. The Republic is dead. Democracy in Spain will not breathe again for nearly 4 decades. The silence that follows civil war is not peace. It is the silence of prisons filling, of mass graves unmarked, of a nation learning which words may be spoken aloud and which must be swallowed. Francisco Franco, Generalissimo and head of state, rules from the Pardo Palace outside Madrid, with the authority of a military victor who owes his throne to no constitution, no parliament, no popular mandate. His regime rests on 4 pillars: the army, the Catholic Church, the Falange Party, and the vast apparatus of repression that ensures no opposition survives in organized form. In the first years, the killing continues. Military tribunals process tens of thousands of Republican prisoners. Estimates of post-war executions range from 30,000 to 50,000 between 1939 and 1943. Concentration camps hold hundreds of thousands more. Political prisoners build the Valle de los Caídos, a colossal basilica carved into a granite ridge north of Madrid, crowned by a cross 150 meters tall, a monument Franco intends as his own mausoleum. Spain's economy collapses into autocracy. Cut off from Marshall Plan aid, diplomatically isolated after the Allied victory in 1945, the regime imposes rationing that lasts into the early 1950s. Hunger stalks the countryside. The years are remembered as the Años de Hambre. Franco keeps Spain officially neutral during the Second World War, though he sends the Blue Division to fight alongside Germany on the Eastern Front. After 1945, the United Nations condemns his regime and most ambassadors withdraw. Yet the Cold War saves Franco. By 1953, the United States needs military bases on the Iberian Peninsula to contain the Soviet Union. The Pact of Madrid grants American air and naval facilities in exchange for economic and military aid. Spain re-enters the international order not through democratic reform, but through strategic geography. In 1955, Spain joins the United Nations. The 1960s bring transformation from within. A new generation of technocrats, many linked to Opus Dei, implement the stabilization plan of 1959, opening Spain to foreign investment and tourism. The results are dramatic. Between 1960 and 1975, the Spanish economy grows at rates exceeded only by Japan. Concrete resort towers rise along the Costa del Sol and the Costa Brava. Millions of northern Europeans arrive each summer. Rural Spaniards migrate to Madrid, Barcelona, and Bilbao, emptying villages that had endured since the Middle Ages. Television enters homes. The peseta stabilizes. A consumer middle class emerges, one that increasingly chafes against political restrictions even as it enjoys material comfort. Franco ages. Parkinson's disease weakens him through the early 1970s. In 1969, he designates Prince Juan Carlos of Bourbon, grandson of Alfonso XIII, as his successor with the title of king. The old dictator dies on November 20, 1975, after weeks on life support. Juan Carlos is crowned 2 days later. What follows astonishes the world. Rather than perpetuating authoritarian rule, the young king appoints Adolfo Suárez as prime minister in July 1976. Suárez, a former regime insider, dismantles Francoism from within. The political reform law passes by referendum in December 1976. Political parties are legalized, including the Communist Party in April 1977. Free elections in June 1977 produce a constituent parliament. The Constitution, ratified by referendum on December 6, 1978, establishes Spain as a parliamentary monarchy, with guaranteed rights, regional autonomy, and separation of powers. The transition faces one final test. On February 23, 1981, Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero storms the Congress of Deputies with 200 Guardia Civil officers firing shots into the ceiling. For 18 hours, Spain holds its breath. King Juan Carlos appears on television in military uniform, ordering all units to return to barracks. The coup collapses by morning. Democracy survives. Spain's long night ends not with another war, but with a telephone call from a king to his generals, and a nation that chooses at last to govern itself. The morning after the coup's failure, Spain wakes into a different country, one that has chosen its future with full awareness of what the alternative costs. Felipe González leads the Socialist Party to a landslide victory in October 1982, and within months Spain formally joins the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, anchoring itself to the Western Alliance. The peseta stabilizes. Foreign investment arrives. In 1986, Spain signs the Treaty of Accession to the European Economic Community, ending centuries of continental isolation. The 12 gold stars of Europe fly beside the red and yellow of the Spanish flag over ministry buildings in Madrid. The transformation accelerates. Barcelona hosts the Summer Olympics in 1992, its waterfront rebuilt, Montjuic illuminated for a global audience. That same year, Seville opens Expo 92 on the Guadalquivir's banks, 500 years after Columbus sailed from Andalusian shores. High-speed rail connects Madrid to the south. Spain's economy grows at rates that astonish its neighbors. A country that was largely rural and autarkic under Franco becomes urban, cosmopolitan, integrated into global markets. Yet the constitutional order faces persistent strain. The Basque separatist organization, known by its initials, carries out bombings and assassinations for decades, killing over 800 people before declaring a permanent ceasefire in October 2011 and dissolving entirely in 2018. In Catalonia, grievances over fiscal transfers and cultural autonomy intensify after the economic crisis of 2008 devastates Spain's construction-dependent economy. Unemployment reaches 26% nationally. New political parties fracture the old two-party system. In October 2017, the Catalan regional government holds an unauthorized independence referendum. Madrid invokes constitutional authority, suspends autonomy, and prosecutes organizers. The crisis passes without violence but leaves scars on the body politic. Beyond the peninsula, the world Spain made endures in forms both visible and invisible. More than 500 million people speak Spanish as a native language, across 20 sovereign nations from Mexico to Argentina, from Cuba to Equatorial Guinea. It is the world's fourth most spoken language by total number of speakers. The grid plan plazas that colonial administrators laid out in the 16th century still organize daily life in Lima, Bogotá, Quito, and Manila. Catholic cathedrals built on the foundations of indigenous temples remain centers of worship and community. Legal codes descended from Castilian law structure courts from Santiago to San Juan. The Cervantes Institute operates in dozens of cities worldwide, teaching the language that Iberian first codified in 1492. The legacy is not only institutional, it is carried in the bodies and memories of peoples shaped by conquest, mestizo and indigenous communities whose ancestors survived encomienda, mita, and epidemic disease. It lives in the syncretic festivals of Oaxaca and the Andes, where Catholic saints wear pre-Columbian faces. It persists in the unresolved debates over historical memory. Spain's own law of historical memory of 2007 attempts to address Franco-era repression, while across Latin America and the Philippines, communities reckon with colonial violence centuries old. Modern Spain, a parliamentary monarchy under Felipe VI since 2014, a member of the European Union, a nation of 47 million, stands as both heir and survivor of its own imperial past. Its literature, cinema, cuisine, and architecture draw global admiration. Its democratic institutions, tested by economic crisis, separatism, and political fragmentation, have held. The language that Castilian soldiers and missionaries carried across oceans now connects continents in commerce, art, diplomacy, and daily conversation. A living network that no treaty of independence could sever, no revolution could erase. The sun did set on Spain's political dominion, but the world that empire built, in stone and syntax, in faith and law, in the faces of 500 million people, endures in the light of every morning. Thank you for watching this journey through the complete history of the Spanish world. If these stories brought the past to life for you, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new documentary.